We are gathered at a critical juncture in history, a time when the concentration of wealth and power has once again closed the gates of opportunity for the many and left the future trembling under the shadow of oligarchy. Yet within us lies not just resistance but resolve, and within the structures that define this moment lies the key to dismantling it. Our task is not simply to name the forces that oppress us, but to understand them as systems both fragile and mutable, so that we might chart a course forward. To understand oligarchy and escape its grip, we must examine its architecture. It is a structure of interlocking dynamics, wealth concentrated in too few hands, institutions rendered instruments of the powerful, and societies destabilized by exclusion and inequity. But in that very structure lies a paradox. It is precisely because these forces are interconnected that dismantling one can weaken the whole. Let us begin then by pulling apart these bonds, exposing the systemic interplay, and identifying the mechanisms of transformation. Wealth and power have always gravitated toward one another, forming an equilibrium that sustains imbalance. Concentrated wealth exacerbates systemic inequalities, which in turn breed discontent, economic, political, and social. This feedback loop is the lifeblood of oligarchy, binding society into patterns of stagnation and unrest. But coexistence need not always support such a dire reality. Consider the implications of disrupting these links. When wealth is distributed more broadly, institutions can begin to stabilize, fostering systems that no longer depend on exclusion. As the systems balance, social unrest diminishes, not because the voices of the discontented are silenced, but because their grievances are addressed. This triad reminds us that coexistence itself is neutral. It is the values underpinning its components that determine whether it preserves oligarchy or creates justice. We have seen historically how these systems unravel when their core assumptions are shaken. From revolutions that redistribute wealth to movements that reshape institutions, the triad of coexistence becomes a triad of balance when we shift its foundation. The question is not whether it can be done, but whether we will choose to do it. The roots of oligarchy run deep, nourished by historical precedents, global economic systems, and the power of corporations. These three forces form a triad of reinforcement, each magnifying the other's influence. Economic globalization has turned competition into domination, enabling corporations to transcend national boundaries and dictate policies once decided democratically. History, meanwhile, offers legitimacy to these systems, cloaking them in the false inevitability of tradition. But what is reinforced can also be unraveled. Globalization, though often maligned, is not inherently oppressive. It is the architecture of exploitation, policies written to prioritize profit over people, that must be dismantled. Corporations, too, are tools. Their function depends on the hands that wield them. And history, rather than serving as justification, can be reclaimed as a guide to alternative futures. Disrupting this triad requires turning its strength, interdependence, into its weakness. Corporations rely on systems of trade, regulation, and consumption that people can alter through action and governance. Globalization, redirected, can connect movements rather than markets. History, reframed, can provide narratives of resistance and reinvention. What reinforces oligarchy can just as powerfully dismantle it. Inequality causes disempowerment, and disempowerment stifles collective well-being. This chain of causality is the essence of oligarchy's grip on society. As inequality grows, individuals lose the means to resist, and a divided populace becomes incapable of imagining, much less building, a better world. But causality flows in both directions, and here we find the mechanism of transformation. Empowerment begins with breaking inequality, not just in wealth but in access to education, opportunity, and decision-making. As people regain power, their collective well-being improves, enabling further empowerment. This feedback loop, unlike oligarchies, is a virtuous cycle, where each gain fuels the next. The strength of this triad lies in its simplicity. The chain of causality requires no revolutionary invention, only a recognition that inequality is neither natural nor permanent. It is a choice, and like any choice, it can be unmade. By redistributing power and resources, we invert the causality of oppression and build systems rooted in fairness and opportunity. Inequality, unjust systems, and democratic erosion form a precarious equilibrium, one that oligarchy depends upon but can never fully control. As inequality grows, systems lose legitimacy and democracy weakens, leading to discontent that can erupt unpredictably. This balance of forces is not sustainable, and therein lies its vulnerability. By addressing inequality, we disrupt the equilibrium, forcing systems to evolve or collapse. Restoring justice to institutions reinvigorates democracy, creating a new balance that resists the concentration of power. Neglect, however, guarantees the opposite. Unchecked inequality destroys trust, collapsing democracy into authoritarianism. Equilibrium, like coexistence, is not inherently good or bad. Its value depends on the forces it balances. Our task is to ensure that equilibrium serves the many, not the few. Stability rooted in justice, not exploitation. Finally, we turn to education, social safety nets, and systemic change, the triad of action that underpins any transformation. Without education, people lack the tools to understand or challenge the systems that oppress them. Without safety nets, survival becomes a full-time occupation, leaving no room for resistance or growth. Without systemic change, reforms are reduced to band-aids on a crumbling edifice. But when these elements align, they become the foundation of a sustainable future. Education provides knowledge and agency, safety nets create space for participation, and systemic change ensures that progress is institutionalized rather than eroded. This triad is not merely a response to oligarchy. It is its antithesis, a blueprint for a society that prioritizes human dignity over profit. We have examined the structures of oligarchy and their negations. And in doing so, we have found not just the source of our predicament, but also the seeds of its resolution. These triads reveal that oligarchy is neither eternal nor invincible. It is a system like any other, subject to the forces of change when people refuse to accept its premises. The path forward is not easy, but it is clear. We must disrupt the coexistence of power and imbalance, undo the reinforcement of inequality, and reverse the causality that stifles well-being. We must rebuild equilibrium on a foundation of justice and empower action through education, security, and systemic reform. Let us move forward not with empty optimism, but with determined understanding, guided by the structures that brought us here and the vision of a better world they make possible. Together, we can transcend oligarchy and build a society that honors the dignity of all.